everyone had a restful, joyful, playful weekend. You got whatever you needed for your mind, body, and soul. I am currently laying outside under some trees, watching the clouds go by, taking in some nice, warm weather. Super grateful. My dog is playing and exploring, and I just wanted to have our conversation this week here about making peace with our contradictions. This is a topic that has been on my mind for quite some time, that I think we can all benefit from having a conversation over. In past conversations, we've talked a lot about how we are all multidimensional. I've often quoted Walt Whitman. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. I wanted to have a conversation about what does this really mean? Almost at a practical level, right? Because we talk about this and then we can acknowledge these contradictions within ourselves, these dimensions of ourselves or aspects of self that just seem so contradictory, so even at war with each other, right? Like we have to pick one or the other, or, a couple over another couple. And so I wanted to talk about, what does it mean? What does it mean to be multidimensional? What does it mean to contain multitudes? What does it mean to be whole? In understanding our multitudes, our multidimensionality, and our wholeness, how do those seemingly even contradictory aspects of self sit together neatly? To have multitudes, to have many dimensions, but also be whole, that even seems, contradictory. I reflected on this a few days ago, and I thought that was a good place to start. I wrote, after college, after waking up even more, I wanted to center deeper, come home to myself, clear out all of the programming, ego, and performing, and get back to who I am, what I like and value and think. Now it's a balancing act. I've got very different parts within me, and I get to marry them in my being. It's not about choosing, it's just being fluid and flexible and always open, but grounded within and unguarded. So what? Who cares? Why not? Have fun, be yourself fully, be kind, endlessly evolve, make good moments, embrace the contradictions. This is something I have always kind of been comfortable with, and I think that for me it's more of like an unearthing process and an untangling process, because I think, again, for me, being comfortable with that, it's really about acknowledging contradictions or feelings within myself that I might not consider obviously contradictory. Whereas a friend of mine in college once told me they were one person at home with their family and one person at school. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, especially with family, right? But even, in a professional setting, in a school setting, in a friend setting, social setting, whatever, we are one person in one situation and like a completely different person in another. And the ideal is to be a solid continuation of self. And perhaps, at work you're slightly more professional, but you're still yourself. And you still have that freedom to express and to be yourself. You're not constricting or constraining yourself. And in any other situation, right? In a familial situation, friends, whatever. even right there, right? If you feel you have to show up differently, get curious about that. Why? What is it in myself that tells me I'm not safe to be myself in this situation? Or what is it in the environment that tells me I'm not safe to be myself in this situation? For me, I felt that those differences of self, I think, very young. And I didn't quite know what to do with them. And I think I just kind of leaned into embracing different expressions of self and being fluid in that. Whereas it might not be until someone goes away from their family or away from their community or away from their comfort zone when they can start to feel that difference in self and upbringing or self and community or whatever, in terms of like maybe I'm not this thing completely. Maybe I'm, we'll get into it. And then my friend went on to tell me that they wanted to be who they were at home, which was in complete contradiction to who they were at school. And in no way is there any judgment at that, right? But I think when we force ourselves to make a choice, right? Like I said earlier, when I was reading on what I reflected on, it's not about choosing. And so when we force ourselves to make a choice, we are denying parts of self, right? We can do things that feel out of alignment with our values, right? But until we get to the core of why are we doing those things in the first place and unpack them, then it's going to create some sort of disconnect and division within. Whereas the truth is, that person, that friend, was a little bit of both, right? They're a little bit of home and they're a little bit of who they are at school. The solution isn't to completely negate one in favor of the other. The solution, like I said, it's about marrying these contradictions within our being. That's the beauty of it. We are this whole being, and yet within our wholeness, we have all these parts, all these aspects, all these dimensions, these nooks and crannies, these contradictions, right? And that's what's so beautiful and interesting about human beings. And some of these contradictions we can sit with, and others are things that perhaps aren't necessarily complementary contradictions, as we could call them, which are perhaps the ones we can sit with. But some of them are, again, maybe patterns of behavior and action that are truly out of alignment with our values, and we need to, again, do that healing work, do that unearthing work, understand what's going on there so we don't continue to repeat those actions that are hurting us in doing them. Because likely we all have these contradictory aspects of self that don't seem to sit together neatly. And like I said, our job, our blessing is to figure out how to marry those contradictions within our whole one being. And in unpacking this and thinking about this, part of it comes back to, simply by virtue of the fact of language. We are taught through language, through words, to define, identify, label, and compartmentalize things. I see a tree before me, right? This tree, this plant, this organism, this being is here before me. I label it tree to communicate with anyone else about it. I don't have to label it tree. In presence, in our present existence with the tree, it can just be, right? I can just be and the tree can just be, and we can have this sort of exchange and experience of each other without any of that labeling or compartmentalizing going on, because the tree's not labeling or compartmentalizing me, So in doing so, in compartmentalizing, we undermine the complexity of everything, right? So when I say tree, you picture a tree, I picture a tree, we have a concept of what a tree is. But you might not be here experiencing the tree, experiencing this singular one being in existence that is in front of me that I'm experiencing. But for matters of simplicity and communication, we have the concept and we communicate via the concept. And in doing so, we undermine that whole experience, right? You're not having the experience, you're just conceptualizing the thing we're talking about in one very specific dimension. Like we talked about with Caitlin in our episode on herbalism, there's a spiritual dimension to it. There's all these different dimensions to even this experience that we're having of everything we're experiencing. There's physical, mental, emotional, psychological, biological, we can go on and on, right? And so when we label, when we identify, when we define, when we conceptualize, it's almost like we're taking all those away, or like vacuum sealing them into a one-dimensional concept, picture on a screen, tree, or in our minds. And it goes far beyond just a tree, right? It expands to the people we interact with, the people that we see on the internet, acknowledging their humanity in a fuller capacity than just this one-dimensional screen. Again, just another example, but it goes so far and deep into everything we experience, because with the internet, right, we're not experiencing certain things. Like when I sit with a tree, there's also biological exchanges going on between that organism and my organism. And when I'm looking at a picture of a tree, either printed out or, a painting or a whatever, it's not the same. There are dimensions that are missing to that. And so there's a very physical element to it, and there's also a very mental, emotional, and psychological element to it, especially when we get into our interactions with people, because then we're diminishing their full humanity when we label. And of course, we even do this to ourselves. We'll get into what I was talking about before, but let's look at how we do it with ourselves. When we are children, for example, we assume the identity of being the children of so-and-so, of our parents or our guardians. While we are in fact their children, and that is, a thing, we are also complete own individual beings separate from them. And we label, right? We tack on the label at the end of your name. I am Lydia. First, we even label with names, right? I'm not just this being. Now I have this label of a name that's another form of a vacuum, right? That's shrinking my whole existence into this name. I'm no longer a person. I am this name. And then we have surnames. I'm not just Lydia, but I'm Lydia Piccoli of the Piccoli family. I am the daughter of the Piccolis. And so there is identity created in that, or through labels, there is the tendency and socializing to identify with that. A child in its own existence is its own being, completely complex, completely whole, completely separate from its parents, right? And yet that child is the child of so-and-so, and they're identified with their parents, and their parents are identified with the child. And the trick is then that typically in society, we think the child is a reflection of the parents and the parents are a reflection of the child. While that is conceptually true, again, these are two individual beings separate from each other, and though they are intertwined, again, they are also completely separate. And the limiting fact there is that then the parent might tell the child not to do things because it's a bad reflection on the parent, and the child might think it can't do things because it's a reflection on their parents, or they think they have to reflect a certain image that their parents want them to reflect. The reality is, as parents, as, caregivers, the object of our care is like a flower. It's just meant to bloom. We are just meant to water it and whatever. We can't make the flower be a rose if it's a daisy. We can't make the daisy be a rose. We just have to let it be and let it grow and let it flourish. Our only job is to nourish it. However, it needs its own nourishment. A rose needs nourishment different than a daisy needs nourishment. And it's understanding how to meet that individual's needs. Again, when we identify with something, in the example of identifying with being the child of so-and-so parent or vice versa, it can come at the cost of our individual identity and individual expression and development. We can go our whole lives without even truly being aware of this, and how it could actually be contracting our willingness to take risks, to step outside our comfort zone, the comfort zone of our family, living in fear of judgment, etc. In that case, it's about a healthy balance between individual and family, knowing who you truly are separate from your family, and having a balanced relationship with the necessary boundaries, etc., that respect both individual and collective, aka familial, well-being in that example. We always say it's neither good nor bad, it just is. But the problem, or the thing that fuels the discomfort of these contradictions within us, I think really comes down to the fact that we think we shouldn't have them. That everything is neat and clean and falls into boxes and is easily labeled, but it's not. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So I was talking to a friend about this subject, and whether it's family, whether it's community, anything, profession, sport, anything, team, anything that creates, there's nothing wrong with that, right? As humans, we are tribal animals. We want to belong in a group. And there is great benefits that comes in being a part of a group, right? However, the problem is when we look at history, right? When we look at what's unfolding around us, is the fact that when we identify too strongly with something, there is the potential to have an us versus them attitude, and there is the potential to have barriers, have separation, to be so ingrained in one identity that we can't acknowledge our other identities, our contradictions, our multiplicity as an individual, as a collective, and we can't acknowledge our common humanity, our part of being part of our truest, fullest family, which is the human family. It's not a washing away of differences, right? Because in the same thing, whether we're talking about on the individual level or on the collective level, right? There is difference. Difference is great. Difference is interesting. Difference should be celebrated. But when we cling to differences so much that there is suffering, or on the collective level, that there is arguing, disagreement, war, fighting, the us versus them mentality, that's where we have and continue to run into problems. I'm not saying don't identify with your family, but I'm saying ask yourself, get curious about how your labeling and identifying benefits you and uplifts you and empowers you, and how it constricts you, closes you, disempowers you. Here's another good example of this without getting into, gender theory, and with all respect to our non-binary friends and trans friends. Perhaps this could even help you if you're a binary person who struggles with understanding gender fluidity. When I was younger, I understood gender fluidity long before I even learned the concept, because although I am a girl with a female body, I am not just a girl. I am Lydia, but I'm also not just Lydia. I am, at the core, a being who happens to exist in this body, with this body. I'm not confined to what has been defined before me as what it means to be a girl, how a girl should act and behave and dress and everything. And this freedom of not identifying with labels or definitions or identities of who I think I am or who I am told I am allows us to be flexible and free to just be in all my wholeness, the wholeness that contains all my multitudes and dimensions. Instead of capping myself at girl or boy or Lydia or doctor or daughter of or son of or mother of, I am here, I am present, and I do what I feel called to do in the moment. I am currently a being sitting under some trees, taking in some sun, watching some clouds go by. In that, I feel completely at peace. It is a suspension of definition, and at the same time, a deep anchoring in the truth, the core of what is. What is this experience? That is what this experience is at its core. Because we all have qualities and traits and expressions that have come to be seen as, again, in this example, seen as feminine and masculine, we are all both. We are just, period. We are us. We all express everything on the spectrum. If we suppress one in favor of the other, we limit ourselves. And again, that's on the individual level and the collective level, right? While we're talking about this at the individual level, we can also recognize it on the collective level. If we limit what girls can be, can do, if we limit what boys can be, can do, if we limit people to being binary or non-binary, whatever limits, we're limiting ourselves collectively, societally. The potential of the collective, the potential of society is limited in perpetuating this. Confined to what a girl or boy should and shouldn't do. This is a classic example is slut shaming in the 21st century, right? Girls are equal, but if she behaves in the same sexual manner as the guy, she's a slut and he's the man. A girl can cry in public and we feel really bad for her, but a boy crying in public makes us uncomfortable. This mentality of boys shouldn't express their feelings, or to be strong is the opposite of expressing feelings. These things have changed, but at the same time, they haven't changed, right? They're supposed to have changed. And it limits us because you're not just a boy or you're not just a girl. You're a human being with expression of feelings, of emotions, of passion, of action. You're not limited in that expression by anything. What limits us is our labels and definitions and boxes and categories and concepts. But those are all man-made, mind-made, and we can let them go so that we can just exist and we can be in our wholeness, in our full expression. If I identify with my deeper nature as simply human being, I am free to have fun and explore and play in my expression, whatever that may be, at whatever moment that may be in the present moment. It's going to be different in this present versus a past present. It's going to be different in this present versus a future present. And that's also the joy and the vast interestingness of what it is to be a human. Staying one thing is incredibly boring, but everything is always changing. And if we embrace that change, we can have so much fun with it. We can enjoy it. When we label others, when we label ourselves, we put things in boxes. We are compartmentalizing. We label ourselves and we label others. Who's to say which comes first in our lives? Likely as children, we picked it up from socializing with other humans that already do this sort of labeling and compartmentalizing and putting in boxes because it's so prevalent and it's so accepted and it's the norm. Or it was truly, truly a norm, and I think it's now kind of starting to shift. But when we label ourselves, we label others. And when we label others, we label ourselves. When we put others in boxes, we're putting ourselves in boxes. It's a two-way street. I guess you could say, as, if you hurt someone else, you're really hurting yourself. I think it could work in that type of idea, right? If I'm compartmentalizing someone else, maybe I'm compartmentalizing myself as not that or with that. I'm in this fraternity and this person's in the same fraternity. We're in the same box. I'm in this fraternity and that person's in that fraternity. We're in different boxes. We're separating, right? Versus coming together and seeing that sameness that goes across the board in all of humanity. And beyond humanity, right? I've been talking in a context that is humanist. Because at the core of it, right, we're all, and this includes trees, this includes animals, this includes human as a species of animals. We are all at the deepest, most fundamental level. We are all extensions and expressions of creation itself. There is similarity there. There is common ground there. Instead of focusing on, I am a human, this is a pig, there is difference. Yes, there is difference, but we are both extensions and expressions in difference of the same thing. And when I focus on the similarity, now I can almost like I'm opening myself up to a bond, to a connection, because there is no barrier there. What was a limit because of separation, because of difference, is now gone. It applies to humans interrelating with other humans. It applies to how we relate to animals and the environment. It applies to so much, right? Everything. It applies to everything. I think it's an indicator of what we're doing inside and outside. So if inside I have these contradictions, or I have, I'm labeling myself, I'm compartmentalizing myself, I'm probably likely doing it outside to other people and things as well, right? It's just an indicator, in the same way that our words are indicators of how we're thinking. How we speak reveals how we think and feel. When we put things in boxes, it likely equates to not allowing for the space for things to be as fluid and flexible and changing as they are. Like we said, everything is ever changing. That's the fact of life. Impermanence, right? Nothing is permanent. And there's a joy in that. There's a sorrow in that. But when we accept it and we can embrace it, we can flow with it. And we don't have to suffer as much because we're clinging to something we wish could be forever, or we wish could end. Everything will end eventually. The thing is, we might think it's easier to label, to compartmentalize, to define, because then we know what it is. There are no surprises. We can be at peace, right? But again, the reality is everything and everyone is ever changing. And it actually creates more chaos and discomfort to label and put in boxes and cling to that quote unquote stability of those things, the definitions, for both the labeler and the one labeled and compartmentalized. Whereas if we hold space for someone to show up as their full self in the moment, and we are present for it and curious about it, then we enjoy the unfolding that takes place as we both share in that experience. When we begin to make space within ourselves for our own multitudes and dimensions and contradictions, and we begin to become familiar with them and get curious about them, notice them, be aware of them, we practice holding space to experience this in others. Like everything, it's a practice that begins within, with us, with each one of us as an individual. Noticing what we do and don't have space and patience for in our own contradictions is the first bit of awareness. Noticing if, in the case of my friend, I am this person when I'm at home with my family and I'm that person when I'm at school, right? I don't know who I am. Who am I? Am I the person when I'm at home? Am I the person when I'm at school, right? I don't know who to identify with. I think I should be the person I am when I'm at school, say. So that's who I'm gonna go in that direction, right? And I'm gonna completely negate the other direction. But the problem with that, right, is the should. That you should, or I should be blank. It's more about the middle path, the middle way. Allowing first for the space to explore and discover, and having enough patience to see what arises as you discover and discern what is authentic. And then marrying it all within your being. When we anchor, again, right? When we anchor in the core of the truth of it, we are the being having these experiences, being aware of this experience. Because once we become aware of what contradictions exist within us, we can unpack why they seem to contradict in the first place. Again, in the case of the school and family example, why are these two things in contradiction? What is in contradiction here? Where do these come from? Why do I feel I need to be one or the other, or pick one? When we become aware of who we think we are, who we think we should be, we have the space and compassion to befriend who we are today. And that's the only person we need to befriend. It's not about putting it off into the future. When I am fill in the blank, when I have fill in the blank, I will be happy, I will like myself, I will befriend myself, because all we have is the present moment. So if you're putting it off, then you're not friends with yourself now, and you probably aren't going to be friends with yourself then when you get it either, because there will still be the void and the vacuum that exists from that lack, from that identifying with who I should be rather than embracing who I am today and befriending that person and that present moment, that present reality, that present experience, those present truths, those present pains, those present contradictions, all of it. When we befriend who we are today, we befriend the wounded child and past selves within us that need us to be there for them. We befriend our shortcomings and our triumphs all in one, because that's what we are. We are a being moving across time. In that sense, we are a timeless being in the present moment. We are made up of so many things within and outside of ourselves that came way before our existence and occurred during our existence. When we unpack it all, we begin to have a say in it, in what we give power to, what we give energy to, in what we identify with and cling with. And when we befriend ourselves, we can let go of who we think we are. Who we think we are is identifying with our ego, our labels, our self and external definitions that are put on us of who we are, i.e., I am a soccer player, I am an academic, I am a doctor, I am an artist, I am a parent, I am a spouse, etc. Sure, we do those things, but we are not only those things that we do. We do many things. We do nothing. We have a deeper nature to us that we all share. We might contain aspects of self, contradictions in ourselves that we think are irreconcilable. But the reality is, they can be reconciled because they exist within us. And that acknowledgement is the start. It's the foundation of that reconciliation, the beginning of the marrying all our parts in our whole. Say I'm a doctor, right? If I identify with being a doctor as my whole person, or as a huge part of, my person, my identity, what happens when I feel unfulfilled in being a doctor? That's going to be a very personal, very different experience to reckon with. I might feel trapped, that I can't leave being a doctor because being a doctor is who I am. And maybe I don't even know who I am without that aspect of self that I cling to as my main self. I would have to rediscover who I am. And this happens all the time, right? In different facets, in different ways, in everyone's own experience. I was just talking to a kid who was an athlete in college. Even as a child, right? We talked about how he didn't even really know who he was besides soccer. And then in college, when he left playing soccer, he had really no idea. And there was a whole crisis and even a crisis of mental health and that experience of not knowing who you are. And I have a friend that went through this same experience and the same thing, right? It's very destabilizing, but it's not. I think part of the confusion is that not knowing who I am is destabilizing. The destabilizing fact in this idea of not knowing who I am is because I clung to an identity so hard that once it was no longer a part of my experience, then I didn't know who I was because I didn't have that to cling to. That's the idea. And I think if we teach children, right? Because it goes back to that. If we teach people to embrace the exploration, right? As we said earlier, and hold space, withhold labeling and clinging. Embrace the discovery, embrace the discerning of authenticity, of what just aligns with me and what doesn't align with me, and learning how to listen to and hear our own inner knowing to be able to make those discernments. Then we have something to work with, but it's a process. It's a developmental process as a human being, right? And I don't know if we're ever even done with it. I don't think we are, because that's also the joy of being a human. Your life doesn't end when you reach X age or X decade of your life. You're not who you are, by the time you're 60, you're solidified in who you are. You can be, if you choose to be, or if you unconsciously choose to be by not changing and not allowing yourself to continue the natural, endless evolution that is part of our experience in life. But I wanted to just say that because I think it's a really important point to highlight with this example. Something I said in our ego episode. We're all walking contradictions. We contain these multitudes. We think by putting ourselves and each other in boxes under labels, we smooth out these contradictions. But the truth is, we don't. That's not smoothing anything. It's just paving over bumps and pretending we can ignore and not feel the discomfort of the bumps. And the trick of society is that it's masquerading this madness of pretending we don't have contradictions, of pretending we aren't these vastly complex beings, of shrinking people down to boxes, that it's masquerading that madness as sanity, which is really insane. What is sane about being inauthentic? What is sane about how that creates inner turmoil? What is sane about not acknowledging someone's full humanity that stands in front of us, but instead labeling them as a slut or as a doctor in the same way, right? We do all these labelings, vicious, horrible things that we ourselves wouldn't want to be labeled. And, labels that hold all this undertones of status and esteem. But at the core, we all share the same existence, which is a vastly complex human being, each one as complex and multidimensional as the next. And the joy in interacting with each other is that we can begin to witness it in one another if we truly hold space for that unfolding. Instead of projecting, we receive. We are just open. And it starts within us. It starts with marrying our own contradictions, looking at them, understanding them, and then reconciling that which feels irreconcilable. I don't think our contradictions inherently create turmoil. Look around, right? In nature, we see contradictions everywhere. Death, life, chaos, harmony. They're all part of something greater, a bigger system. They all exist within a balance of an ecosystem. In nature, in an ecosystem, if any one of the beings that make up that ecosystem is removed, the whole thing collapses. The contradictions are necessary. Everything, it all is working in balance as a whole. When we let go of who we think we are, we can become acquainted with who we truly are across time and space, undefined by past and future and just present. which is at the core of it a being of awareness. As we've been saying, we are aware of all that happens, our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. We are both the doer and the witnesser. And when we identify with who we are at our core as the witnessing awareness, when we get into that seat of awareness, rather than identifying with our thoughts as ourselves or our actions as ourselves or our roles in our lives as who we are, we find more space to exist in our multitudes comfortably and to fluidly go between them and around them and zigzag and all over the place within all these dimensions that exist in our contradictions, and be at peace at the same time in that. From there, we're able to create the same space for others to show up whole instead of feeling the need to fracture themselves with labels and definitions and compartments, and I show up this way with these people and that way with these people, and this is who these people want me to be. We don't put them in boxes. We don't put ourselves in boxes. And in fact, in not doing that with ourselves, we are inviting others to step outside the box they might be in. So what does it mean to be multidimensional? Well, that is what we all are after we move from that level of, that core depth of being, of awareness, of just being, right? I am just a being. I am here now being. We have all these different expressions and preferences and dimensions and likes and dislikes and interests, contradictions. That's what it is to contain multitudes. So to then be whole is in fact to contain all those multitudes and dimensions. We are the whole sum of all the different dimensions and multitudes, as well as the deepest depths of our being and our true nature. As at the very most core of it, the very most simple level is an extension and expression and continuation of creation itself. Wholeness requires space and suspension of identification, or rather identifying with our depths of who we are that are unchanging, i.e., an extension, expression, and continuation of creation itself, and a being, and a human being. And allowing that flexible fluidity that also is inherently true to our nature. As another example, I've spoken about fashion in conversations before we've had on the podcast, and I've spoken about how that was the path that I was on. And one contradiction for me is that, I admire fashion deeply as an art and a form of self-expression. The truth is, it also sits with me as a contradiction. I've gone through phases of my life where I've let that, and I've identified with that as like one of my core identifiers, right? In the path that I was on, I realized if I continued down that path in the place that I was at, in the mentality that I had in that industry, it would continue and grow into that core identification that we just spoke about avoiding that clinging, that ego, in what may seem to be a stark contrast, a stark contradiction. I care about the environment. I'm very into the natural world. You could call me a hippie, you could call me earthy, you could call me crunchy, granola, whatever. I also care deeply about issues and questions of justice and humanity and society. And so for a while, it felt like I had to choose, or it felt like if I was super into fashion, I couldn't also care about and be interested in the earth and, those questions of justice and humanity and society. It felt like one negated the other and the other negated one of them, and they just didn't fit right. And, when I was deeply immersed in fashion, I felt unfulfilled. I felt a lack of meaning. I felt like something was missing. And it's all about finding a balance, right? It's about finding a place between all of these different things and interests where giving energy to one and the other and everything all feels right and feeds my soul and nourishes me. Because the truth is, fashion is an art, and fashion is a form of self-expression, and it's a form of, for me, food for my soul. There are, there's a lot more to this, but I want to keep it simple, right? Because complexity can always be distilled down to simplicity. And there are two things I came to a conclusion about this. One, something I reflected on that stands, for more than just fashion is the following. Fashion is, like all of us, a contradiction. What we can't accept about its contradictory nature, we can't accept about ourselves. What we can't make peace with about that, we haven't looked ourselves in the mirror with. But this was on the subject of the elitist, materialist nature of fashion and the business of fashion, but it goes beyond fashion. When we can't accept what we can't accept about anyone or anything's contradictory nature, we just haven't looked at ourselves in the mirror and accepted our own contradictory nature. Because again, we all have those contradictions. And number two, we are much more interesting in our contradictions, in our multitudes, in our multi-dimensions. How interesting to be interested in fashion and the philosophy of fashion, the art of fashion. How much more interesting to be interested in fashion, its contradictions, its intersections in other walks of life, and to be interested in the earth and the natural world and hiking and social justice and social philosophy and the improvement of society and education and all the other little interests and nuances and soul food that I have, that you have too. It's much more interesting. And that's just one example of the many ways, I personally have felt these contradictions, felt in between or neither nor. With that example that I just provided, I felt in between both of those, aspects of self, you could say, but they're right. They're not really even aspects of self. They're just my interests that I felt in between them. I felt like I didn't belong to either of them because I was interested in one and also interested in the other. And again, it's about marrying them. I didn't necessarily know how to marry them. They were so seemingly contradictory. How could you even marry them? But the truth is, we are both and. It's an interest of both and. I'm interested in this and I'm interested in that. I'm interested in both. And the marrying happens again in my being, in my own simple interest in that and this. I was listening to Renegades, Obama and Bruce Springsteen's podcast. It was either the episode where they talk about their father's masculinity, fatherhood, or looking towards American renewal. I don't recall which one it was. I listened to them all on the same day. Recommend them all. I recommend the whole series. The link is in the description. Obama made a remark about contradictions. It was probably in the America one because he was talking in the context of finding unity in America in such a divided time. He said, "We get into such heated arguments because we are arguing about contradictions in ourselves." And this really, I wrote this down, it really struck me because, again, it's right on this same thing we've been talking about. When we don't acknowledge these contradictions in ourselves, we outwardly argue about them. Or when we argue with our contradictions in ourselves, we argue about them outwardly too. If we make self-judgments about this thing I do, I ascribe this amount of worth to, or I ascribe this as being bad or good. And so when I see it in the outer world, I'm going to ascribe that worth or judgment of bad or good to it as well, because that's what I've decided to do within myself. And those contradictions I argue about within myself, I argue about them outside. If we make peace with the contradictions in ourselves, there is less fire to heat an argument. In fact, instead of pouring gasoline on the fire because we're arguing about contradictions truly within ourselves, we're pouring our inner peace, our inner acceptance, our inner spaciousness and graciousness with ourselves onto conversations and others and our experiences. We don't have to argue anymore, not within ourselves and not externally. And I think let's end on this example, on this idea that I've also been thinking of. For me, the more I learned and experienced and deepened my understanding about the injustices of the world, the inequity, the greed, the evil, the destruction and degradation and disrespect of life and the environment, the more I started to feel hatred and anger towards humanity, or to blame a portion of humanity. But the fact of the matter is, right, like we sit here with a reself, and part of our why is that we haven't been taught how to do these things. We haven't been taught about the importance of the intersection of philosophy, sciences like psychology and neuroscience, and practices and rituals, and how integrating that intersection really empowers our well-being and our personal evolution, not only individually but collectively. So what I have hatred and anger towards in humanity, I've learned to look inward and see how I harbor that hatred and anger towards myself. How do I express greed? How do I express selfishness? How do I express taking more than I need? How do my actions impact the environment? And what can I do to do my part? And what can I do, again, to help myself evolve as just as equally an integral part of this picture as, someone in politics or someone who's running a $1 trillion company who has incredible influence. It's about turning inward. And again, considering my judgments and hatred and anger as reflections of judgments and hatred and anger within myself. Because I find that when I do that, it's a lot easier for me to sit with the nature of the world as it is today. It's a lot easier for me to have compassion for the fact of where we are, to hold space for, look, we're humans and we're still evolving. And we've made great strides, we've had great failures. And just as I as an individual and you as an individual have had great strides, and we've had shortcomings that, we're not proud of, but we've healed through and we own as a part of our story. In holding that space, I find hopefulness and I find optimism that we're still growing, we're still evolving, the best is yet to come. And it's the same as an individual as it is with the collective, as it is with humanity, right? Sure, we have great pressures on us right now as humanity, as especially again with the environmental crisis and growing inequality and inequity. These are all real problems. Just as individuals, we have real problems in our lives, but it's nothing we can't handle. It's nothing we can't solve. And again, in that vein of human evolution, right? We've done a lot of evolution. We've done a lot of making strides in medicine and this and that. But it's just as we have to marry these contradictions within ourselves, right? We have to marry the contradictions within our humanity. And we have a deeper evolution into our humanity and what it means to, with the dimensions of humanity, the dimensions of our well-being as humans, of our spiritual nature, of our interconnection, of our oneness. So, just some food for thought that I hope that's a good example to end on. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Our inner contradictions are very interesting things, and in conclusion, it's all about balance, baby. It's all about the middle way, finding the middle path, marrying these contradictions in our incredibly complex and interesting and intricate individual human expressions, and anchoring in our deepest depths and nature as simply a being in existence, in awareness, and an extension and expression and continuation of creation itself, of this process of creation that has been going on for millions, if not billions of years, trillions, who knows? All you need to know, and all I need to know, at the core of it, at the root of it, at the foundation of it, of ourselves, of our existence, we are a continuation of this process of creation of the universe, of existence, of being. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for chatting. Thanks for giving yourself this conversation, this time. Incredibly exciting news. Our pre-launch mindset workshop preview is live. This is the perfect fresh start, reset, rebalance, level up for your mindset. Working at the fundamental level of your mind, this self-paced experience guides you through a deep dive into your thoughts, beliefs, and patterns of behavior to self-sufficiently navigate and actively nourish your mindset so you flourish in alignment with how you want to show up in your life, fully in your wholeness and your full authenticity. If you're dealing with contradictions, if you're trying to unearth some of this stuff, it's a great place to start. It all starts in your mind. So check it out. The link is in the description. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram, Pinterest, Tumblr, whatever floats your boat. Spotify for our playlists. Good stuff over there. Always keeping the vibes up, positive. Have a great rest of your week. Bye, everybody.